Я бы хотел говорить с вами по-русски. Для меня это очень трудно, потому что я без практики. Я понимаю, но это первый раз, долго я не говорил ни слова по-русски, поэтому говорим по-английски.
Отлично, спасибо вам
Спасибо.
большое.
My father was born in a small town in what was still Russia, which is now Latvia, called Dvinsk. He was born there, and he grew up in this little provincial town, but somebody interested in everything that was going on in the world and bursting to get out of this little closed provincial heavy weight of what it was at the time. And by the time he was 16, he had heard all the revolutionary talks and tracts and papers, and he became a revolutionary. And he entered secretly the Communist Party, and he gave speeches in public, which was so revolutionary that his parents, who had a shop there, were appalled because he made one flaming speech, and he said, we must take a knife and plunge it into the stomach of these fat bourgeois all around us. And as that was all the sort of family connections and friends, they were all appalled. But he continued, he was a true revolutionary, but of such conviction that he was invited to be a delegate from his area at the age of 16 to a big secret revolutionary conference in Moscow. He went to Moscow, and of course, it had already been denounced to the police, and so they were all arrested, including my father. 16-year-old boy in prison. His father then started doing everything that people did at the time, for asking, going there, undoubtedly paying money right and left, and in the end got it agreed he could be released from prison if he got straight out of the country. So he was taken to the frontier, and a beautiful girl of his age that he'd met by the bandstand at a seaside place near Rigor at that time, at Cabin. He'd met her, they'd fallen in love, and she followed him. And they came straight here to Paris. And they went to the university here, to the Sorbonne, and my father was interested in becoming an electrical engineer. He studied electricity, and my mother wanted to become a doctor. But then my father discovered that there was a much better course in Liège. So he said, we go to Liège. They went to Liège, and my mother, to the disappointment of the rest of her life, discovered that there was no faculty for medicine there. So she became a chemist very brilliantly. He studied electricity, science, and she studied chemistry, science. And they were there at Liège University when the Germans, in 1914, they got married in Liège. They were there, and the Germans started advancing and advancing. So with many people, they moved away until they came to the coast, to Ostend, and the Germans still advanced, and there were boats leaving. So they got on the first boat, which took them to England. They got off of a boat, were lined up, and there were people writing down all the deeds. They came without passports or papers. They just wrote down the names of the people they were letting into the country. And my father, perhaps he spoke a bit, by then he spoke French, and they said, so tell us, what is your name? And he said, Brook. And they said, how do you write it? And he said, Brook, in the Russian way, B-R-Y-K. So the man writing, B-R-Y, Bryk? No, that's not possible. So my father said, no, B-R-Y in Russia, it's pronounced Brook. Oh, he said, Brook, of course, that's a good English name, B-R-O-O-K, that's your name. He went into England. He then worked for the war, worked in laboratories, a scientist. My mother also worked there, and they settled from then onwards in England. He became very deeply touched by the quality of English life and really wanted there. And he had a very true intuition although until he left Brussels, he had remained a true revolutionary and who wrote for French, Belgian, and particularly Russian papers and Russian émigré papers, strong articles, political, Marxist articles on the current situation and on the world. When the 1914 war came to an end, and where normally it would be natural, along with all his friends, because of the real Russian community then in London, to go home, he recognized that everything that he had stood for as a revolutionary was the opposite of Bolshevism. He was a Menshevik by nature, and he saw that Bolshevism was going to destroy the ideal of Marxism, destroy communism by its violence and its ferocity. So he said, not only I want to have nothing to do with Bolshevism, and so he stayed in England, eventually became naturalized and became an Englishman, but also he had the very true intuition, prophetic intuition, to say, I have 3 sisters. One sister is living in Riga, and this is now Latvia, and he kept in natural touch with her. The other sister had, at the same time, I think at the end of the war, had left with her husband, who was Polish. So I think that she'd moved to Poland, and then they left and came to settle where they were attracted, like so many Russians were at the time, to Paris. He was a dentist, and they came and settled in Paris, and they had a son and a daughter, and the daughter was very close to me until she died, Ina. And his favorite sister, I mean, he liked his sister, but he had that one, as in every family, special favorite, Fenya, remained in Moscow. And his immediate flair, his immediate intuition was that the moment the revolution was over and the war was over, he felt, I will do nothing to get in touch with her, although everything in his heart wanted to. But his intelligence said no. From now onwards, it will not be good for her to have a relative, and most of all, a brother abroad. So in fact, he never, from that on, neither by letter, he didn't even ask some traveler going to Russia or coming to Russia, just kiss my sister for me. He just thought even that could be used against her one day, and how right he was. He foresaw what would come about 15 years later. But he just, and for that reason, he never knew that she had a son, that the son was Valia, and that's how it is that when, years later, I went to Russia, I had no way of knowing that anybody of my own family would be there in Moscow. When I came to Moscow for the first time, when we did Hamlet at the Mchat with Paul Schofield, I was told that this was the first time a company from England had come to play in Russia since, I think, Catherine the Great. And I had no idea whatsoever that I had any relatives in Moscow. So I had never heard of Valia. While I was there, the first thing I wanted to do, for me, the Russian theater, since I started working in the theater, was a legend. Stanislavski, the great Russian theater, was a legend, but of course I'd never seen anything. So the first thing I wanted to do was to see productions everywhere, to see what this Russian theater was that people told me about. So I went to see various productions, and I can now tell the truth, I was very disappointed, because at those days when we were beginning to look at a way of breaking out of the whole academic weight on the English theatre of the 19th century, and I, being young, was only interested in new ways and new forms, I found the Russian theatre not only very academic, but I found that even the plays themselves, and particularly classical plays like Shakespeare, were not only academic in our sense, but in the style of the opera. So I saw productions that were really like big, elaborate productions. And then I went to the Bolshoi Theatre and saw this same big academic tradition. And this was very surprising. Some of them are marvelously well executed, but still no sense of that new life and vitality I expected to find. Then I was invited to see a play that I was told was a new production of Klopp, of Mayakovsky. I hadn't heard of the play. I went, not knowing what to expect. Suddenly, I saw a work that was so free, so dynamic, so extraordinary, and I must say, I had a secret impression, if I were working here, that's the way I would have liked to do it. It's extraordinary knowing the result. I had a certain affinity even with the style of staging. I go backstage, and there I met all the cast, including a charming lady who was in them, who was very, very warm and open to me, and I was told she was the wife. She was the actress, but also the wife of the director, Pluchek. We left. She said how sorry she was that her husband had had an engagement that night and he couldn't be there, and that was the end. The next morning, in the National Hotel where I was staying, the phone rings, and a man says to me, Peter Brook, yes, I want to ask you a few questions. Oh, can you tell me, where did your father come from? Where was he born? When did he leave Russia? Now, as an Englishman coming at that period after the war to a still Stalinist Russia, this was at once, not only the secret police, but everything that I was at once against. And I said, you have no right to ask me a question like this. Who would you think you are to put questions like this? A long pause and then a little voice. I think I'm your cousin. I said, come quickly. So he came straight over to the hotel, and that was the beginning of a family relation and a friendship that lasted until he died. After this first meeting that was so exciting and so moving, of course, the next thing was to meet properly as part of the family, Zena, his wife. I went to their apartment, we spent some time together, we then corresponded, but it was still the period when people had great difficulty in having visas in Russia to go abroad, so it had to wait for quite a long time before he next had permission to come to London, meet my brother, meet my father. I can't tell you any longer whether he came to England or whether I came on our next visit, which was when we came with King Lear, which was quite a time later. But by the time we'd come with King Lear, we were in simple contact. And again, when I was there next in Moscow, of course, dinners with my wife, with his wife, all together in their apartment. Then I would go again to his theatre, to the Satyri Theatre, see his new work. And gradually, it became possible for him to travel. At first, always delegatia, always official. I remember him coming to London, being with all the others in a hotel, and then gradually they got freer. And then by the time that we did the Mahabharata, Mahabharata in X, he came to X. He could see the whole play. And then later, when we did Carmen, I remember him coming here to see Carmen, and we had 3 Carmens. It was the first cast we had. We played it every night for a week, and for this to be possible, we had 3 casts that were always interchanging. I had done something that's never done in opera. I had rehearsed them all together. we had 3 first nights, and I made it a very strong principle that there was to be no hierarchic difference. There wasn't number 1 cast, A cast, B cast. They were all the same. When Valya arrived here, and with the tradition of opera as he knew it, I said, we have 3 casts. So he said to me, yes, but I want to see the best one. Which is the best one? And I said, there isn't a best one. They're very different, but for us, they're all the same. So he took me aside, not only as a cousin, but as a fellow professional. And he said, yes, but between us, just tell me which is the better one. I said, Valya, I can't. They are the same. So he came to see all 3, and then he realized that. But one of them was, we have 3 very, very good comments, but each of the women appealed to men on a different level. And there was one particularly, he said, but that's the one that I like, I'm most attracted to. I said, fine. But for performance and singing, no. Later I could follow his work more closely. One of the productions that struck me most was The Suicide. Because The Suicide, on every level, on one level, it was marvelously staged, and with freedom, a sense of a real ensemble who are really playing together with great openness, freedom of movement, natural freedom of staging. There was nothing fixed, rigid. No, it was all free. But the freedom was also reflected in the fact that it was, at that time, to me, I couldn't believe that he could have had the courage to introduce there from a major Moscow theater, not only The Bedbug, but then this play, The Suicide, which was so daring in its satirical approach to Russian society. And I always admired greatly the fact that he, having started with a figure who was already a damned figure, tragically, which was Meyerhold, perhaps the greatest genius of mise-en-scène in the whole of present-day Europe up to today. The great genius was Meyerhold. Valya was deeply connected to him. He started with him as an actor, then became his assistant, was deeply touched by him, and carried on, when he became the director of the Satiric Theatre, this heritage, not of an absolutely respected establishment figure like Stanislavski, who the whole of the Stalinist establishment respected. I mean, that was one man who was beyond reproach. But this dangerous figure whose qualities were so dynamic that, of course, it led to him being murdered. And that Valya could carry that heritage, go into the world of satire, and have come through it, was a tremendous tribute to his having the 2 qualities that every director has to have: a tremendous honesty, integrity, and a clear vision of the reality of life, and at the same time, a practical sense of how, which you have to do as a director every day with rehearsals, just how far to go, where you wait, where you see a possibility, where you're daring and where you're prudent, where you're cautious. And I so admired that his directing, the way he ran his theater, and his relation with the society, with Soviet society, all reflected that same quality. And so in that way, he was a very astonishing person as a man and as an individual. I speak bad Russian, but sufficient to be able to communicate with him. And as always, with a foreign language, one understands better than one speaks. I'm very often asked questions in many different contexts about theatre in general, the problems of the theatre, the future of the theatre. But I think both Valya and I, when we talked together, never talked in big general theory. We only talked about specific, practical, concrete things. I did an interview with him, just on sound tape, which I still have kept very preciously, where I interviewed him just for myself and for ourselves here about his early experiences, particularly with Meyerhold. And so we had a long, at least 1 or 2 days here, where I asked him to tell me all his memories in the way that I'm now talking about him, in the way he talked about how he met, how he was as a young man, a very fiery young actor, and he was engaged as an actor, how this moved on to being assistant, how marvelous stories of how Meyerhold would suddenly discover the secret of a staging in the very last moment, how he would work, and then suddenly he would come early at the theatre, start rearranging the furniture. Suddenly people would come in and he said, we're going to do it all differently today. How in one time Meyerhold had to stage a contemporary play that he didn't think any good, but it was clearly that there was a political reason why the theatre had to do this play. He had no option. And everyone thought it would be very, very boring. And he tried to find how he could bring it to life. And then Valya gave me 2 examples. One of how he staged a scene in which a number of drunken people arrive at a party in such a way that it became legendary, the staging of that scene. And another where in a very boring scene, long, boring text, he suddenly had the idea, because it was about bureaucracy, and he came into the theatre and said, bring me all the sheets of paper that you can find anywhere in the theatre, and then he hung them up above the stage, and then during the scene, all these sheets of paper, like snow, would fall on the stage, and this made an enormous impression of the audience and got past a very bad scene. So it was in that sort of way that we talked together. Both Valya and I knew one another at times when we were both enormously occupied with our own work and responsibilities. I couldn't suddenly, in the middle of that work, just fly over to see him in Moscow and spend a weekend with him, as one could easily with somebody nearby, and the same for him. He would have loved to have come over to see all of us and all the family, but he hadn't the opportunity, so that when a possibility was evoked that I might come and do a production, and knowing that the great quality of working in Russia is that rehearsals are very long, although that in England and America in those days there was still this tremendous pressure to do everything in 3 weeks or 4 weeks, and I'd been fighting to push that farther and farther back to get 6 weeks, 8 weeks, or until we came to the Bouffe du Nord, where for the first time we could spend months and years preparing something. I knew that this was the only reason to do an interesting work in Russia would be to use that conditioning, particularly with an outsider coming and working with their actors. And I would clear I could never ever find the possibility of leaving a responsibility for this theatre, the Bouffe du Nord, leave all other work and go and spend 6 months in Moscow. So it never came about. Of course, my brother and I, of course, suffered from the reality of this situation. We could, both of us, rediscover our only direct cousin, because there was the cousin in France who died shortly after the war, and Ina, the cousin who was close to us. And then there was Valya, who my brother also came to know very well, and who we saw in the same way, individually and together. But none of us had any knowledge whatsoever, other than our father telling us that the one he loved so much was Fenya. We knew nothing whatsoever about her, and curiously, the best of my memory, I can't remember ever talking about her with Valya. It seems now, looking back, very strange, but I think that with him, his wife, who was an exuberant, splendid, very good actress, an splendidly exuberant woman and totally committed to her husband, and so continually on the warpath, whether somebody in the theatre had done something not right, whether he was properly appreciated. There was so much of her vibrating to support him right after the last, that I don't think that the question of the previous generation ever arose between us when we were together. What is considered the art of the director is something that originated at the end of the 19th century in the Russian theatre. This figure, so controversial, of the director, was invented by Russia. And in the end of the 19th century, the early years of the 20th century, there was that enormous explosion of talent that comes with pioneers discovering a new continent. And through this, two extraordinary figures arose who have dominated the whole of the Russian theatre, and that was Stanislavski and Meyerhold. And of course, at first Meyerhold worked for Stanislavski in the way that Valia worked for Meyerhold, and at first Stanislavski was the master. But very rapidly, Meyerhold being a revolutionary, independent one, his relationship with father and son with Stanislavski broke apart, and gradually they went in two apparently different ways. Stanislavski going into one direction, which led to this absolutely everyday life drenched naturalism, and Meyerhold into this biomechanical sense of this everything coming through a free use of the body, developed really like an athlete and like a clown. And in Stanislavski's theatre, this was not the case. So it would seem that the two were going in completely different directions. Many, many, many years ago, about the period that we're talking about, when I was first meeting with Valia, I was invited in Moscow. I was there with some play, I forget what. I was invited to give a big public talk about, I think it was a Stanislavski year, I can't remember the context, but anyway, it was to give a talk, and Meyerhold was still somebody that people hardly dared mention, because he was so much in disgrace. And the whole theme I brought, which I could feel as I spoke, it was disturbing, shocking, and at the same time interesting people. So I said, these two men were not in opposition. They were both looking for the same thing. Both Stanislavski and Meyerhold wished to go through the forms of theatre to something beyond that, a higher quality that could give life and fresh meaning to every one of the forms. Stanislavski in one direction, because we can't, any of us, work in every direction at once, Meyerhold in the other, but in fact, the two of them were only looking for a certain thing that audiences and critics called magic, which is a very misleading word, but that something more than could be there, something invisible that gives a new freshness and a new immediate life to the visible. And it was very clear to me that both Stanislavski and Meyerhold could be united through the fact that their deepest search had nothing to do with the outward forms and what was discussed, naturalism against biomechanics. No. Two searchers for quality. And historically, although it suited so many people to create a division between them, that division never really existed. Meyerhold, who publicly, and in some polemics, had to attack productions of Stanislavski. Stanislavski, because of his position as the sort of father of the Russian theatre, had to take a distance from some of Meyerhold's experiments, but personally, the love and respect, the father and son relationship, never changed to the end. And when Meyerhold had his theatre closed by the authorities, and after years and years when he was just building a brand new theatre in Moscow, and suddenly he turned out completely, from day to night, a completely rejected man. Stanislavski, already quite old, intervened immediately and not only invited him to come and join the direction of his theatre, but did something even more daring. He said, I'm now running the opera studio, which was but it was a very important thing, the opera studio, to make new experiments to improve the quality of performance within opera, and that was a very important new field to open. And he said to Meyerhold, I want you to come, and I want you to work with us, I want you to direct an opera. And there was a report, which is one of the most moving things in theatre history, that Stanislavski called the whole ensemble of the opera studio together. And they came in, and they were all sitting on chairs, and there was one chair, like this, facing them, the chair of the master, Stanislavski. And always with this big ceremonial respect that there was in the Russian theatre at that time, all the actors, the writers, the dramaturgs were there respectfully in front of the master, who was the director. And there they sat and waited, and instead of Stanislavski just coming in and sitting down, he came in with someone else. And suddenly they realized that someone else was Meyerhold. And even more surprised, Stanislavski, instead of taking his seat, said to Meyerhold, this is your seat. This, ladies and gentlemen, is my successor. This, with a man who's had his theatre closed by orders of the Kremlin.
Very
Imagine
courageous.
what a courageous thing it was. And for a year he could protect him, but the machine was remorseless and too powerful. And so after a year, I think it was because Stanislavski died first. I think, if my history isn't wrong, that Stanislavski's died, and that protection being removed right away, he was taken, thrown into a prison, tortured, writing letters that have since been released, which are deeply moving, to Molotov and to Stalin. Everything ignored, and he was executed in the cellar of the prison.